Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping into a medieval town at the hour when the day begins to fold itself away. Not the grand Middle Ages of tournament banners and polished armor. Not the world of kings painted in bright manuscript colors. We are entering by a smaller road, where the mud keeps the shape of cartwheels, where smoke lowers itself between timbered houses, and where the last light catches on a bucket of water beside a door. A woman stands there for a moment before she goes inside. She may be young, with a child on her hip. She may be older, with red hands from washing, and a back that has learned the weight of work. She may be a wife, a servant, a widow, a daughter still under her father's roof. Her name matters to the people who know her, but to the law, her name is often tied to someone else's. Someone's daughter, someone's wife, someone's widow, someone's responsibility. The street around her is not empty yet. A man passes with a bundle of sticks over one shoulder. A boy drives a reluctant pig toward a yard. Somewhere, behind a half-open shutter, someone is laughing too loudly over ale. The bell from the church does not sound dramatic. It sounds ordinary. That is what makes it powerful. It belongs to the rhythm of everyone's life, telling them when to pray, when to gather, when to stop, when to remember that the world has an order. For women, that order had many doors. Some were visible: a father's house, a husband's house, a church porch where vows were spoken, a market stall where she might sell bread, ale, cloth, eggs, herbs, or whatever her hands could make, a manor court where neighbors stood close enough to smell one another's wool, a birthing room where pain, fear, prayer, and female knowledge filled the air. Other doors were harder to see. The door between obedience and suspicion, the door between respectability and ruin, the door between being protected and being controlled. A woman in medieval Europe did not usually meet the law as a single written thing. Most people never held a legal book. They did not sit quietly with parchment and read the rules that governed them. Law came through other voices: a priest's warning, a husband's authority, a father's arrangement, a lord's demand, a neighbor's accusation, a clerk's record. A custom everyone claimed had always been that way. It lived in habits. It lived in what people expected before anyone explained it. A girl learned early that her body carried meaning. How she walked, where she went, who saw her, who spoke to her, whether she laughed in the wrong place, whether she was alone at the wrong hour, all of this could become part of her story. And a woman's story, once handled by other people, could turn dangerous. Reputation was not decoration. It was shelter. A good reputation could help her marry, trade, borrow, survive, and be believed. A damaged one could follow her from house to house. It could sit beside her in court before she opened her mouth. It could make ordinary acts look guilty. This is one of the quiet cruelties of the medieval world. The law did not need to watch every woman every moment, because the community watched for it. Not always with hatred. That would be too simple. Often it was done with concern, piety, habit, envy, fear, or the steady human appetite for knowing other people's business. A neighbor might truly believe she was protecting the peace of the parish. A mother might warn her daughter harshly because she knew how little mercy the world could have. A man might call his control protection and be believed. The harshness was woven into ordinary life. A woman might rise before dawn, pull embers alive under ash, stir a pot, feed animals, carry water, wash linen, tend a child, help in a field, spin thread by the door, bargain in the market, and still be told that her proper nature was weakness. She might keep a household from collapse and still have limited claim over what the household owned. She might bring money, land, skill, labor, or family alliance into a marriage, and yet once married, find that her legal identity narrowed beneath her husband's. She might be trusted with birth, sickness, food, memory, and the thousand fragile tasks that kept people alive, but not trusted fully with freedom. That contradiction is where this story begins. Medieval society needed women constantly. It needed their hands in kitchens, fields, workshops, brewhouses, dairies, sick rooms, and nurseries. It needed their bodies for heirs. It needed their labor for family survival. It needed their marriages to join households and settle property. It needed their piety to soften domestic life, and their obedience to confirm male authority. But need did not become equality. Often, need became control. The more important a woman's role was to family order, the more closely that role could be guarded. Her chastity mattered because inheritance mattered. Her marriage mattered because land and alliance mattered. Her speech mattered because public disorder mattered. Her obedience mattered because the household was imagined as a small kingdom, and a kingdom, people believed, could not have two rulers. So the law entered the home. Not always with soldiers or chains, more often with assumptions. A wife should obey. A daughter should be guided. A widow should be watched if she had property. A poor woman should work, but not step too far outside what others considered proper. A woman alone should explain why she was alone. It is easy from far away to think of this only as a list of restrictions, but for the woman living inside it, it was more like weather. Some days barely noticed, some days bitter, some days dangerous enough to change the course of a life. Imagine her walking to the well in the blue-gray light of morning. The rope is rough. The water is cold enough to sting her fingers. She hears two women nearby lower their voices when she approaches. Perhaps it means nothing. Perhaps it means everything. In a town or village, words did not vanish after being spoken. They traveled. They grew. They found ears. A rumor about a woman could become a moral concern. A moral concern could become a complaint. A complaint could become a summons. And by the time she stood before men who asked questions, the story might already have hardened around her. Still, she was not merely afraid. That would also be too simple. Medieval women were not shadows moving through male history. They argued, negotiated, remembered debts, hid coins, managed servants, ran shops, brewed ale, healed neighbors, gave testimony, raised children, chose allies, resisted husbands, entered convents, mourned fiercely, loved unwisely, prayed sincerely, and found ways to make space inside systems designed to shrink them. Some women used the courts themselves. Some defended property. Some accused men who wronged them. Some widows became surprisingly powerful because widowhood, painful as it was, could loosen the grip of male guardianship. Some abbesses ruled communities of women with wealth and influence. Some market women knew exactly how to bargain with men who underestimated them. But every freedom had a condition attached. A woman might act, but she had to act through the narrow passages available to her. She could be clever, but not too bold, devout, but not strange, skilled, but not threatening, independent, but not suspiciously independent. The medieval world loved categories, and women who slipped between them could become unsettling. The obedient wife was understandable. The virgin saint was understandable. The grieving widow was understandable. The humble nun was understandable. But the loud woman, the unattached woman, the sexually rumored woman, the healer with too much knowledge, the servant who accused her master, the wife who struck back, the widow who would not remarry, the poor old woman with no man clearly responsible for her. These figures made society uneasy. Law often grows sharpest where society feels uneasy. That is why the story of women under medieval law is not only a story of written rules. It is a story of fear. Fear of disorder, fear of desire, fear of uncertain inheritance, fear of female speech, fear of hunger, sin, scandal, and households slipping out of control. And beneath all that, there is another fear, quieter but more revealing. The fear that women were necessary in ways men could not fully command. They gave birth, but birth was dangerous and mysterious. They prepared food, but food could heal or harm. They tended illness, but healing knowledge could look suspicious. They shaped children, carried memory, moved through neighbor networks, and knew the private weaknesses of households. They were placed beneath authority, yet they stood at the center of life's most intimate powers. So medieval law tried to name, arrange, and contain them. It did not always succeed. Tonight, we will move through that world slowly. We will not only ask what women were forbidden to do, we will ask what those prohibitions felt like. In a room, at a table, beside a bed, before a priest, in a market, in the hush after an accusation. We will follow the law where it touched daily life, into childhood, where a girl learned that her future might be decided before she understood it. Into marriage, where affection and survival could exist beside contract and control. Into the household, where work gave women importance but not always power. Into the street, where women earned money while being watched for disorder. Into the body, where modesty, childbirth, sexuality, and blame became matters not only of flesh, but of law and salvation. And later, into the few narrow spaces where some women found room to breathe. For now, the woman at the doorway lowers her hand to the latch. Behind her, the room waits with its small darkness. A pot near the fire, a stool worn smooth, a sleeping child, a piece of cloth that still needs mending, the smell of smoke in the beams, the kind of tiredness that does not need to be described because every working body knows it. Outside, the town continues murmuring. Inside, another law begins, the law of supper, silence, duty, and whatever private thoughts she keeps safely to herself. She closes the door, and we begin there. A girl in medieval Europe did not need to understand the law for the law to understand her. It was already there on the morning she was born, not written above the cradle, not spoken cruelly into her ear, but present in the way people looked at her future. A son might mean a stronger claim to land, a firmer hand in the fields, a name carried forward in public records. A daughter meant something different. She could be loved with the same tenderness, wrapped in the same linen, fed from the same tired breast. But around that love stood questions. Who would marry her? What would she bring? How much would she cost? Who would answer for her until then? In a poor house, these questions had the smell of bread and smoke. In a noble one, they smelled of wax, parchment, and cold stone. The scale changed, but the pattern remained. A girl's future was rarely imagined as a road she would choose alone. It was a passage arranged through family need, custom, and the watching eyes of others. She learned this before she learned its name. She learned it in the small corrections of childhood. Sit properly. Do not run there. Lower your voice. Cover your hair. Come back before dark. Do not speak to him. Do not laugh like that. Do not stand in the doorway too long. A boy might be scolded for wildness, but wildness could still belong to his growing. In a girl, the same wildness often became a warning. Her body was treated as a future problem, not because she had done anything, because one day people believed her body would carry honor, temptation, inheritance, sin, pregnancy, alliance, and shame. Long before she desired anyone, others were preparing rules for her desire. Long before she became a wife, her virginity could become a matter of family value. Long before she understood marriage, her marriage could be discussed like weather coming over the fields. This was one of the first harshnesses. She was watched before she was dangerous. In the house, she worked early. Childhood was not protected in the modern sense, especially among the poor. A girl might carry water while still small enough to spill half of it down her skirt. She might mind a younger child, sweep rushes, gather kindling, feed hens, spin thread, help her mother brew ale, or stand near the hearth learning the patience of pots. Her hands entered the life of the household long before anyone called her grown. Work taught her usefulness. The law taught her dependence. If her father lived, he often held authority over her choices. If he died, another male guardian might step near. In some places and classes, women could inherit, especially if there were no sons, but inheritance did not always mean freedom. Land brought value, and value attracted management. A girl with property could become a prize to be guided, married, guarded, or claimed through legal language she might never read. For wealthier families, her marriage could bind estates, settle rivalries, strengthen alliances. For poorer families, marriage might mean one less mouth at one table and one more worker at another. Either way, her consent mattered unevenly. Church teaching insisted marriage required consent, and that idea was not meaningless. It gave some women language to resist forced matches. But language is not the same as power. A young woman could be asked whether she agreed, while surrounded by everyone who had already decided what agreement should sound like. Imagine her standing near a church porch, not yet a bride, only a girl old enough to understand that adults speak differently when futures are being arranged. Her father's hand rests on his belt. Her mother says little. The man being discussed is not cruel, perhaps. He may have land, or tools, or a decent trade. He may be twice her age. He may be a stranger. The priest may speak of order, duty, and God's design. No one needs to raise a voice. Pressure can be very quiet when everyone calls it wisdom. Girls also learn from stories. Eve, whose disobedience opened the door to sorrow. Mary, whose obedience made her holy. Female saints praised for chastity, suffering, silence, endurance, and miraculous courage. These stories could comfort. They could also narrow the imagination. A girl heard that women could be sacred, but often through purity. Powerful, but often through renunciation. Admired, but safest when obedient to God rather than to themselves. Still, girls were not empty vessels. They watched everything. They learned which neighbor beat his wife and which one only shouted. They learned which widow kept her coins hidden. They learned which women spoke boldly at market and which women avoided being noticed. They learned the price of eggs, the danger of gossip, the moods of fathers, the softness of grandmothers, the secrets of childbirth whispered too late at night. Much of their education was never named as education, but it was sharp. A girl might not own her future, but she studied the world that wanted to own it. And sometimes, inside that study, small forms of selfhood began. A hidden preference, a friendship, a refusal delayed until the last possible moment. A prayer that was not exactly the prayer she had been taught. A memory of being treated unfairly and knowing, without yet having words, that something in it was wrong. The law preferred clear categories: maiden, wife, widow, nun, servant, daughter. Life was less tidy. A girl might be obedient and angry, frightened and clever, pious and curious, dutiful and full of private judgment. She might step into marriage because she must, but carry with her a mind that had been watching for years. So before we reach the husband's house, before contracts, dowries, beds, pregnancies, courts, and punishments, we need to pause here beside the girl before the law. She stands in the half-light of a doorway, listening to adults decide what kind of woman she should become. Her hands are still small, but already the world has begun to close around them. Marriage was often described as a holy bond, but in medieval life it was also a practical arrangement made of land, money, labor, family pressure, and risk. A woman might enter it wearing her best dress, with her hair covered, her hands cold, and half the village watching. There may have been affection. There may even have been love. Medieval people were not strangers to tenderness. They wrote love songs, kept tokens, mourned spouses, and remembered the warmth of a hand just as people do now. But marriage was never only a private feeling. It joined households. It moved property. It settled expectations. It placed a woman into a new legal weather. Before marriage, she might be under the authority of her father or guardian. After marriage, in many places, her identity became closely tied to her husband's. The exact rules changed from region to region, but the pattern was familiar. A wife's legal independence often narrowed. Her labor became part of the household. Her sexuality became tied to lineage. Her obedience became a public expectation. People could speak of marriage as protection, and sometimes it was. A husband might provide food, shelter, status, and defense in a harsh world. A woman alone could face danger, poverty, suspicion, or exploitation. Marriage could make survival easier, but protection had a price. The same husband expected to protect her could also command her. The same house that sheltered her could become the place where she had the least room to say no. The same marriage that gave her social respectability could make disobedience appear not only personal, but sinful, disorderly, and legally troubling. A wife did not simply marry a man. She entered his name, his roof, his debts, his temper, his reputation, his kin, his trade, his bed, and his place in the world. Dowry made this sharper. Among families with property, marriage negotiations could turn a young woman's future into careful arithmetic. Money, goods, land, clothing, livestock, tools, or household items might travel with her into marriage. These things could be meant to support the new household, to secure her place, or to strengthen the match. But once given, they were not always hers to freely control. A chest might hold linen stitched by women over many evenings. A ring might carry a family promise. A strip of land might represent years of work. To the bride, these things could feel personal. To the families, they were also bargaining pieces. To the law, they could become claims, obligations, disputes, and records. For poorer women, the matter was less grand but no less serious. A girl might bring little more than clothes, bedding, skill, and a body trained to work. That too had value. A wife could brew, bake, wash, plant, harvest, sell, mend, carry, nurse, and bear children. In a household near hunger, those acts were not small. They were the difference between endurance and collapse. Yet useful labor did not guarantee authority. A woman might know how every corner of the house functioned and still be told the house was not hers. She might keep accounts in her head while her husband signed the agreement. She might remember who owed the money, which child needed shoes, how much grain remained, which neighbor could be trusted, and still be spoken for in public matters. This was one of marriage's quiet cruelties. Women were necessary enough to be used, but not always recognized enough to be free. Church law added another layer. It taught that marriage required consent, which could sometimes protect women against forced unions. But it also taught hierarchy within marriage. A wife was expected to be faithful, modest, sexually available within accepted bounds, and obedient to her husband's rightful authority. The husband, too, had duties. He was expected to provide, not abandon, not abuse without limit, not betray the order he represented. Medieval marriage was not supposed to be pure male appetite without responsibility. But the balance was uneven. When a marriage went badly, a woman's choices could be narrow. Separation was possible in some circumstances, but divorce as a modern legal freedom did not exist in the same way. Annulments were complex and often depended on church courts, kinship rules, proof, influence, or money. A poor wife with a violent husband might have few safe doors open to her. She could return to family if family would take her. She could complain if anyone would listen. She could endure, as many did. She could resist quietly, which was dangerous. Imagine a woman sitting beside the hearth after everyone else has slept. The room is not peaceful, only still. Her husband's boots are near the door. A child turns in the straw. The fire has sunk into a dull red cave. In that dimness, marriage is not a ceremony. It is daily proximity. It is the mood of the person beside you. It is whether coins are spent carefully or drunk away. It is whether your body belongs to rest or obligation. It is whether your words become conversation or defiance. Law entered that room through expectation. A good wife was supposed to maintain peace. If she argued too loudly, neighbors might remember. If she refused her husband, religious language could be used against her. If she left, people might ask what fault lived in her. If she stayed, her suffering might disappear into the ordinary silence of households. Still, women were not merely swallowed by marriage. Some wives became skilled managers of family life. Some ran workshops beside their husbands and continued after the men died. Some negotiated debts, hired servants, defended children, arranged marriages, and shaped decisions from behind the official name on the record. In towns, wives of craftsmen and merchants often knew the business intimately. In villages, peasant wives worked land with a practical authority no document could fully erase. Marriage could confine. It could also become a field of strategy. A woman learned when to speak, when to wait, when to ask through a relative, when to use a priest, when to gather neighbors, when to hide money, when to press a claim, and when silence protected more than truth. These were not romantic freedoms. They were survival skills. The law imagined obedience as simple. Life made it complicated. Because a wife might obey and still shape the household. She might submit in public and argue in private. She might be legally covered by her husband and still carry the memory of what had been hers before marriage. She might love him and fear him, depend on him and resent him, build a life with him and know that the building had unequal doors. And when we ask how harsh medieval law was for women, marriage gives one of the clearest answers. It was harsh not only because it punished rebellion, it was harsh because it made dependence look natural. It told a woman that safety, respectability, food, children, sex, work, property, salvation, and obedience all belonged in the same room, and then asked her to live there gracefully. At the church porch, the vows might be spoken in daylight, but the true weight of marriage settled later, in the locked chest, in the shared bed, in the account unpaid, in the child crying before dawn, in the husband's name attached to her own, and in the quiet knowledge that the law, when it entered the house, usually knew which voice it expected to hear first. In medieval life, the household was not simply a place to sleep. It was a workplace, a storehouse, a nursery, a kitchen, a sick room, a small economy, and a place of discipline. It had its own hierarchy, its own habits, its own punishments, silences, bargains, and debts. For a woman, the household could be the center of her importance and the limit of her freedom at the same time. A wife might know every sound inside it, the scrape of the door before dawn, the cough of a child before fever fully arrived, the different footstep of a husband who came home pleased, tired, drunk, or angry, the soft shifting of mice in stored grain, the hiss of fat when it met the pan, the creak of a chest where linen, coins, or marriage goods were kept. These were not small things. They were the texture of survival. A household had to be managed constantly. Bread did not appear because someone wished for it. Water had to be carried. Fire had to be kept. Ale had to be brewed. Animals had to be fed. Cloth had to be spun, washed, patched, and worn until it could barely hold itself together. Children had to be watched not only with tenderness, but with fear, because illness could move through a house faster than prayer. Women carried much of this knowledge. They knew what could be stretched, what could be saved, what could be traded, what could be hidden. They knew which neighbor might lend a pot, which cousin might help during childbirth, which herb soothed a stomach, which priest was stern, which man in the lane should be avoided after dark. Yet inside the legal imagination of the time, this knowledge did not always become authority. The household was often pictured as a little kingdom, with the husband as its head. Religious teaching, custom, and law all tended to support the idea that order began with obedience. The wife might be central to the house, but the husband was supposed to govern it. That idea gave men power over daily life. A husband could correct, command, forbid, approve, spend, represent the household in public. His failures might harm everyone, but his position remained protected by the structure around him. A wife could advise, plead, resist, delay, soften, or manage, but her power was often indirect. Indirect power can be real. It can also be exhausting. A woman might spend her life learning how to move around a man's authority without openly breaking it. She might choose the right hour to mention a debt, wait until he had eaten before raising a worry, send a child with a message he would not accept from her, ask a priest to speak where she could not, turn to her mother, sister, neighbor, or servant for the kind of counsel that never entered official records. Much of women's history lived in those unofficial rooms. Near the hearth, rules were made and bent. A wife might hide a few coins beneath folded cloth because she knew winter was longer than her husband admitted. A mother might teach her daughter which words not to say in front of men. A servant girl might learn that silence could protect her, but also trap her. A widow visiting at dusk might bring news more useful than any written notice. The household watched women closely because it depended on them. Their sexuality mattered because children and inheritance mattered. Their speech mattered because quarrels could spill into the street. Their labor mattered because hunger had no patience. Their obedience mattered because a disordered household was seen as a threat to the order beyond it. This is why private life was never fully private. If a couple fought loudly enough, neighbors heard. If a woman was beaten, neighbors might know and still call it a domestic matter, unless it crossed some uncertain line. If she left the house too often, people talked. If she welcomed someone at the wrong hour, people talked. If food ran short, if children looked neglected, if she spoke sharply, if she drank, if she borrowed, if she traded too boldly, people talked. The wall of the house was thin, not only in wood and plaster, but in social meaning. A woman's conduct inside could become a matter outside. A husband's authority could be defended by other men. A wife's reputation could be measured by whether the household appeared orderly. And order, from the outside, often meant that she carried strain without making it visible. But there was warmth too, and it matters not to erase it. A household could be a place of real affection. Women sang to children, sisters shared labor, grandmothers told stories in the fading light. Husbands and wives sometimes worked as true partners, bound not only by law, but by habit, need, humor, and tenderness. A woman could love the very house that limited her because it held the faces she cared for most. That is one reason the system endured. Control rarely arrives wearing only cruelty. Sometimes it comes mixed with bread, kinship, shared grief, a sleeping child, and the comfort of familiar walls. A woman might defend the household fiercely, even while being diminished by it. She might fear disgrace, not because she loved obedience, but because disgrace could harm her children, her mother, her chance of trade, her place among neighbors. Medieval law understood households as units of order, but women lived them as breathing spaces, full of compromise. They learned the geography of a room the way others learned roads. The corner where a child could sleep away from drafts, the shelf where the last good bowl sat, the beam where herbs dried, the patch of floor that stayed damp, the place where a husband dropped his belt, the place where a wife stood when she needed to answer carefully. Inside that geography, life could be tender, harsh, boring, frightening, and deeply human within the same hour. A wife might knead dough while angry, nurse a baby while listening for footsteps, laugh with a neighbor while hiding worry, fold her wedding linen years after the vows, touching the cloth and remembering a younger self who had not yet understood what marriage would ask of her. The household was a small court because judgment lived there. But it was also a small world because everything necessary lived there too. Fire, food, birth, illness, sleep, money, sex, prayer, discipline, memory, secrets. And at the center of it, very often, stood a woman whose work kept the walls from failing. The law might call her dependent. The household knew better. It simply did not always reward her for it. A medieval woman's work began before anyone praised it. It began in the dark, with hands searching for yesterday's embers under ash. It began with water carried from a well, grain measured with care, a child shaken gently awake, a pot set over the fire before the house fully remembered itself. Work was not a separate part of her life. It was the shape of the day. And yet, work did not always make her powerful. A woman could labor from morning until the last lamp went out and still be described as dependent. She could help feed a town and still be treated as morally unreliable if she stood too visibly in public. She could earn money and still find that money claimed, managed, or questioned by men. In villages, women worked beside men in the fields. They weeded, harvested, gathered, milked, carried, brewed, baked, washed, spun, and tended animals. Their bodies knew the year by its demands. Spring meant mud and planting. Summer meant heat and flies. Autumn meant urgency, storage, aching backs. Winter meant repairs, hunger calculations, smoke-thick rooms, and the slow work of keeping people alive. This labor was ordinary, which made it easy to undervalue. No one needed to announce that a woman had kept the household functioning. They noticed only when something failed. Bread burned, ale spoiled, linen went unwashed, a child sickened, a debt was forgotten, a hen disappeared, supper thinned too far. Good work vanished into expectation. Bad work became evidence. In towns, women were everywhere. They sold fish, eggs, herbs, candles, cloth, pies, ale, and second-hand goods. They worked as laundresses, servants, brewers, midwives, spinners, seamstresses, healers, shopkeepers, and helpers in family trades. Some wives of craftsmen knew the tools, customers, debts, and rhythms of the business as well as their husbands did. Some widows continued trades after their husbands died, stepping into a public role that had always depended on them but had not fully named them. The market gave women movement. It also made them visible. A woman at a stall had to speak. She had to bargain, call out, refuse a bad price, defend the quality of her goods, answer insults, remember who owed her, and decide whom to trust. These were not the soft virtues praised in sermons. They required sharpness. A market woman could not survive on silence alone, and that made people uneasy. The same society that needed women's selling often mocked or punished women's speech. Too much talking could become scolding. Too much confidence could become disorder. A loud man might be called forceful. A loud woman could be called unruly. The line between trade and trouble was thin when the trader was female. For poor women especially, respectability was hard to protect. Poverty forced them into public spaces. They had to carry, sell, borrow, plead, serve, and negotiate. They might work in other people's homes, where their own safety depended on the character of masters, sons, guests, and servants above them. A servant girl could be watched for sexual danger, while also being exposed to it. If something happened, suspicion might fall on her as easily as on the man who harmed her. Work gave women necessity, not safety. Guilds often limited female access to skilled trades, though practice varied. A woman might work unofficially beside a husband, learning the craft without gaining the same recognition. If he died, she might briefly be allowed to continue, especially if she had children or apprentices to support. But her right could depend on local custom, male approval, and how much she was seen as preserving a man's business rather than claiming one of her own. The pattern returns. Women could do the work, but the world hesitated to call the work theirs. Even brewing, a trade long associated with women in many places, could shift as it became more profitable. What women did for household survival might be tolerated. What became money, status, and regulation could begin moving into male hands. Profit had a way of changing who was considered proper. Still, women built lives in these cracks. A brewer knew which neighbor watered his ale and which customer paid late. A seamstress heard family secrets while fitting sleeves. A midwife knew who had conceived too soon after a wedding, who feared another birth, who had bruises under her shift. A market seller watched men who thought themselves unwatched. Women's work created networks of knowledge. Knowledge was useful. Knowledge was dangerous. A woman who knew too much about bodies, births, herbs, debts, desires, or households could be valued in one moment and feared in another. People came to her for help when they needed her. Later, if something went wrong, the same knowledge could be turned against her. The healer became suspect. The midwife became too intimate with secrets. The poor old woman became someone whose muttered words frightened children. There was no single medieval female experience. A noblewoman's work might involve estate management, correspondence, household supervision, marriage diplomacy, and the care of servants. A peasant woman's work might leave her hands cracked from water and frost. A townswoman might count coins behind a counter. A nun might copy texts, manage land, teach girls, or run an infirmary. Their burdens differed, but all lived in a world that measured women's activity against ideas of obedience, modesty, and control. A woman could be busy and still accused of idleness if her work was not honored. She could be skilled and still called merely helpful. She could be indispensable and still legally secondary. Picture a woman in the market near closing. Her basket is lighter now. Her feet ache. Her voice is rough from bargaining. She has kept back one small coin without telling her husband, not for vanity, but because children fall ill, shoes split, grain runs short, and men do not always plan for the small disasters women are expected to solve. As she folds her cloth, she hears laughter from two men nearby. One imitates the voice of a quarrelsome wife. Another says women talk too much. She does not answer, not because she has no answer, but because she knows the cost of giving one. She lifts the basket. The street is cooling. At home, more work waits. The law may not follow her with a written page. It does not need to. It has already shaped the wages she can claim, the trade she may enter, the trust given to her speech, the suspicion attached to her movement, and the ownership of what her hands produce. And still, under all of that, she works, not gently, not symbolically, really, with wet sleeves, sore wrists, smoke in her hair, and a mind quietly measuring everything. For medieval women, the body was never only private. It belonged to the self, but also to family honor, marriage law, religious teaching, village gossip, inheritance, childbirth, temptation, and fear. A woman lived inside her body, but other people constantly interpreted it. They read it in her clothing. They read it in her pregnancy. They read it in whether she bled, conceived, miscarried, resisted, desired, aged, healed, or failed to heal. Modesty was one of the first languages forced onto the female body. Hair covered, necklines watched, movement measured, speech softened. A woman's clothing did not simply keep her warm. It announced whether she understood her place. To appear too rich, too loose, too uncovered, too decorated, or too careless could invite comment. And comment in a tight community was rarely harmless. A veil could be cloth. It could also be evidence. Respectable women were expected to guard the boundary between visibility and shame. This did not mean all women moved silently through the world. Many were bold, funny, practical, sharp-tongued, and impossible to ignore. But the official ideal praised restraint. A woman's virtue was imagined as something that could be damaged by sight, speech, touch, rumor, or even suspicion. Her body carried the reputation of others. A daughter's chastity affected her family's standing. A wife's fidelity affected inheritance. A widow's sexuality unsettled people because she was no longer under a husband's daily control. A servant girl's vulnerability could be treated less as her danger than as someone else's scandal. Sexual misconduct was judged unevenly. Men could be punished too, but women often carried deeper shame. A man's wandering might be treated as sin, weakness, or expected vice. A woman's could become proof of disorder. Her body could be turned into a public warning. This is what happens when women are not guarded. And then there was childbirth. No part of life revealed the contradiction more clearly. The female body was treated as morally suspect, yet society depended on it completely. Every noble inheritance, every peasant family, every town household, every future priest, soldier, lord, servant, and laborer began in a woman's pain. Birth took place in a world of heat, blood, prayer, female hands, and real danger. A laboring woman might be surrounded by other women, a midwife, neighbors, relatives, older women who had seen enough births to know when hope should be quiet. The room might smell of sweat, herbs, smoke, damp linen, and fear. Someone might murmur prayers to the Virgin. Someone might heat water. Someone might hold the mother down when pain made her body fight itself. Men often stood outside this room, but law and religion still entered it. Was the child legitimate? Had the mother conceived too soon? Would the infant live long enough to be baptized? If the mother died, who would inherit? If the baby died, who was blamed? Childbirth was intimate, but its consequences were public. A woman's pregnancy could prove marriage, expose adultery, secure inheritance, or destroy reputation. A swelling belly was never just a swelling belly. It was counted, watched, timed, and remembered. For unmarried women, pregnancy could be terrifying. The body announced what the mouth might have hidden. A concealed pregnancy, a stillbirth, an infant death, these could become matters of suspicion and accusation. A frightened young woman might have needed help, mercy, privacy. Instead, she could find herself facing moral judgment when her life was already breaking. Even within marriage, fertility was a burden. A wife was expected to bear children, especially sons. If she did not conceive, blame might settle on her, whether or not the cause was hers. If she bore too many children, her body paid the price. If she died in childbirth, grief might be sincere, but the system that had risked her life remained unchanged. The body was also where sickness and healing became complicated. Women treated bodies constantly. They washed wounds, cooled fevers, delivered infants, prepared herbs, sat with the dying, and remembered what had helped before. Much of this knowledge was practical, inherited, and necessary. A village could not survive without women who knew how to tend pain, but useful knowledge could darken under suspicion. A woman who knew herbs might heal a child one winter and be whispered about the next. A midwife could be trusted with birth, then questioned if a baby died. An older woman living alone, especially one who was poor, sharp, or disliked, could become the place where fear collected. This did not mean every healer was accused or every midwife was feared. Life was more ordinary than that. Most women did their work, helped one another, and carried on. But the danger existed in the background. Female knowledge of the body was needed, yet never entirely comfortable to authorities who preferred women obedient, supervised, and explainable. A woman's body was judged most harshly when it seemed to escape control. Desire escaping marriage, pregnancy escaping legitimacy, speech escaping modesty, age escaping usefulness, knowledge escaping male oversight, poverty escaping household protection. This is why the law around women often felt less like a wall and more like a net. It caught different women in different ways. A noble woman might be watched for heirs, a peasant woman for labor and chastity, a servant for sexual danger, a widow for property and remarriage, a midwife for what she knew, a poor old woman for what others feared. The body changed, and the judgment changed with it. A young girl had to be guarded, a bride had to be modest and fertile, a wife had to be faithful and productive, a mother had to be self-sacrificing, a widow had to be respectable, an old woman had to be harmless. At every stage, there was a correct way to be seen, and yet, within these rules, women kept living in bodies that were not symbols to them, but flesh. Bodies that ached after work, bodies that enjoyed warmth, bodies that feared another pregnancy, bodies that remembered touch, bodies that grew tired of being watched, bodies that carried children, hunger, bruises, milk, scars, and secrets. Imagine a woman sitting near a dying fire, unlacing a dress after a long day. No court is present, no priest, no husband perhaps, only the small sound of fabric loosening, the marks on her skin from labor, the heaviness in her lower back, the private relief of being unseen for a few moments. This, too, is history. Not only the law that judged her body, but the body that endured the law. Before a woman reached a courtroom, the village may already have tried her. Not formally, not with parchment, seals, or a clerk scratching words into record, but in doorways, at wells, beside market stalls, outside church, over washing water, behind shutters left open just enough to hear. A reputation could be built there slowly, one small judgment at a time. She speaks too sharply. She is seen too often alone. Her husband cannot govern her. She laughs with men. She drinks. She borrows and does not repay. She knows too much about herbs. She has no man to answer for her. None of these words had to be true in order to become dangerous. They only had to be repeated. In medieval communities, law did not float above daily life. It grew out of it. Neighbors accused neighbors. Parishioners reported moral failings. Lords held manor courts. Church courts watched marriage, sex, vows, defamation, and spiritual discipline. Town courts handled disorder, debts, trade, violence, and public nuisance. The boundaries shifted, but one thing remained. People lived close enough for private trouble to become public business. For women, that closeness could be suffocating. A woman's good name was one of her few protections. It helped her sell goods, arrange marriage, borrow money, defend herself, and be believed. Without it, every action became easier to twist. If she came home late, there must be a reason. If she argued, she was unruly. If she was poor, perhaps she was dishonest. If she was unmarried, perhaps she was available. If she was old and disliked, perhaps she was dangerous. Gossip was not merely noise. It was a kind of weather that could turn into law. Imagine a woman summoned before a local court. She is probably dressed carefully. Not finely, unless she has rank, but carefully enough to show respectability. Her hair is covered. Her hands may be raw from work. She stands among men who know her husband, her father, her debts, her quarrels, or the rumor that brought her here. The room may not look like a modern courtroom. It might be a hall, a church space, a manor gathering, a town chamber. The floor is cold. The air smells of wool, damp wood, old smoke, bodies pressed too close. A clerk waits to write. Men speak in the language of authority, and even when women are allowed to answer, the setting itself tells them whose voices carry more weight. Some women came as accusers. Some came as defendants. Some came to claim unpaid wages, defend inheritance, challenge a marriage, answer charges of sexual misconduct, or complain of slander. They were not absent from legal life, but presence did not mean equality. A woman might speak, yet be doubted. She might tell the truth, yet be measured against her reputation. She might be wronged, yet asked whether she had invited wrong. The harshness often lived in that gap between being heard and being believed. Public shame was one of the law's favorite tools. Medieval punishment did not always hide itself behind walls. It often wanted witnesses. A scold might be humiliated before neighbors. A sexually accused woman might be made an example. Someone who broke trade rules, violated moral expectations, or disturbed public order could be placed where the community could see her reduced. The point was not only pain, it was memory. A fine could be paid and forgotten by those with money. Shame lingered. It taught the watching crowd what behavior had a cost. It made the punished body into a lesson. For women, whose respectability was already fragile, public humiliation could wound deeper than the formal penalty. A man might be mocked and still return to authority. A woman publicly shamed might carry the mark into every future bargain, every marriage negotiation, every dispute, every whispered introduction. This does not mean men were never punished harshly. They were. Medieval law could be rough with many bodies, but women's punishments often struck at the exact place society had made most vulnerable: reputation, modesty, sexual honor, and belonging. A woman accused of being a scold reveals this clearly. The word did not simply mean a woman who spoke. It meant a woman whose speech was judged disruptive, quarrelsome, excessive, unfeminine. Her voice became the offense. A wife who answered back too often, a neighbor who argued too loudly, a market woman who defended herself too sharply. Any could become a problem if the community decided her speech disturbed order. But what was she supposed to do? Silence could protect her. Silence could also erase her. If cheated in trade, she had to speak. If slandered, she had to speak. If abused, she might need to speak. If hungry, unpaid, abandoned, or threatened, speech could be survival. Yet the same voice that defended her could be used as proof that she was troublesome. That trap shaped many women's lives. They learned to choose words like stepping stones over dark water. Too soft and no one listened. Too firm and they became the issue. Too emotional and they were unstable. Too calm and they were cunning. The law did not need to say all this aloud. Custom taught it. Defamation cases show how much reputation mattered. Women sometimes sued over words that damaged their sexual honor, because such words could ruin their lives. To be called unchaste was not a passing insult. It could affect marriage, work, family standing, and safety. A woman might drag another person into court not because she was dramatic, but because a spoken accusation had material force. Words could take bread from the table. They could close doors. They could make a woman touchable in the eyes of men who already wanted permission. So women fought over words because words had teeth. Still, court could sometimes offer a narrow path. A widow might defend her dower rights. A wife might seek separation from a cruel husband. A young woman might insist a marriage promise had been made. A market seller might demand payment. These actions matter. They remind us that women were not only crushed by law, they sometimes used it, entered it, bent it toward survival. But even when they won, the cost could be high. To stand publicly and tell your pain is not simple. To repeat private injury before men who may doubt you, to name a broken promise, to admit violation, to expose household disorder, to place your life into the mouths of others. The court could give judgment, but it could not give back innocence, privacy, or peace. As evening falls after such a hearing, imagine the woman walking home. The matter may be settled, or only beginning. A fine paid, a warning given, a rumor sharpened, a neighbor satisfied, a husband angered, a clerk's line added to a record that will outlive everyone in the room. She passes the well where people will ask what happened. She knows they already know something. She also knows they do not know everything. That is the loneliness of public shame. The crowd sees the surface and mistakes it for the whole truth. Behind the door, she removes her veil. Her scalp aches where the cloth was pinned too tightly. The room is dim. Work still waits. Supper still has to be made. Children still need answers she may not have. The law has spoken for the day, but the village will keep speaking longer. For many medieval women, freedom did not arrive young. It came, if it came at all, after loss. A widow stood in a strange doorway. Behind her was marriage, with all its duties, protections, bargains, fears, and habits. Before her was a life no longer arranged around a husband's living authority. People pitied her, watched her, sometimes helped her, sometimes circled her property like birds over a field. Widowhood could be grief. It could also be the first time a woman's legal voice grew louder. In some places, a widow could claim dower rights, manage property, continue a trade, make contracts, appear in court, arrange children's futures, and decide whether she wished to marry again. Not always easily, not always safely, but more directly than many wives could. This is one of the sharpest contradictions in medieval women's lives. A woman might gain the most independence only after the man who defined her social safety was dead. Imagine her after the burial. The house is quieter, but not peaceful. His cloak still hangs near the wall. His tools lie where his hand last left them. Children look at her differently now, half frightened, half expectant. Neighbors come with soft voices and practical eyes. Someone mentions debts. Someone asks about land. Someone wonders whether she will remarry. Mourning had barely begun, and already the world was reorganizing her. If she had money or property, she became important. If she had none, she became vulnerable. A poor widow could fall quickly into dependency, especially if she had children, illness, or no trade to continue. Respect for widowhood did not fill an empty pot. Pity did not pay rent. A woman without male protection could be seen as needing help, but also as available for pressure, suspicion, or exploitation. The widow's freedom was real, but narrow. She might run her late husband's shop because customers already knew her hands had been running it for years. She might brew, sell, lend, collect, negotiate, and defend what was owed. She might be addressed with new seriousness in legal matters, but that seriousness could turn quickly if she appeared too bold, too wealthy, too unwilling to remarry, or too interested in choosing her own path. People liked widows best when they were useful, modest, and temporary. A widow who remarried returned to order. A widow who remained independent asked the world to tolerate a woman standing in her own name. Some did. Many had to. Medieval records contain women who sued, bought, sold, managed, donated, and directed affairs with remarkable force. But every act carried the question beneath it. How long will others allow this? Another path away from marriage led through the convent. To modernize, a convent can seem like confinement, and it could be. Some girls were placed there by families, not chosen by pure calling. Noble households sometimes sent daughters to religious life because land, dowries, politics, or family strategy made marriage inconvenient. A convent wall could be a spiritual shelter, but also a decision made elsewhere. Yet for some women, religious life offered something marriage did not. A room without a husband, a community of women, access to learning, time for prayer, reading, music, administration, healing, teaching, manuscript work, and influence that did not depend on bearing children. An abbess could command estates, manage servants, correspond with powerful men, oversee schools, and act with authority that would have been difficult for a married woman outside religious life. Her power was framed as holy, which made it more acceptable. She did not rule as an ordinary woman. She ruled as a bride of Christ, safely removed from the sexual and domestic suspicions attached to wives and widows. That safety had a price. The nun's body was controlled differently. Chastity, enclosure, obedience, and discipline shaped her days. Bells cut time into pieces. Meals, silence, prayer, labor, sleep, all moved by rule. But within that rule, some women found a life of the mind and spirit unavailable elsewhere. A girl who might have been married into fear could become literate. A woman who did not want a husband might gain a holy reason to refuse one. A widow, tired of bargaining with the world, might enter a house where her grief could become devotion. Convents were not perfect sanctuaries. They held rank, politics, conflict, illness, ambition, and loneliness. Rich women and poor women did not always share the same comfort, but they offered a different arrangement of female life. Not freedom in the modern sense, but another shape of dependency, sometimes gentler, sometimes intellectually alive, sometimes deeply chosen. There were also women who lived between categories. Beguines in parts of medieval Europe formed lay religious communities without taking permanent monastic vows in the same way as nuns. Some lived piously, worked, served the sick, prayed, and supported themselves. To some, they seemed holy. To others, unsettling. Women living together without husbands, outside full convent control, always made authorities ask questions. Again, the pattern returns. A woman outside ordinary male household rule could be admired, but she had to be explained. Holy widow, bride of Christ, pious servant, poor penitent. Respectable categories protected women, but also contained them. The woman who simply wished to live by her own judgment had fewer words available. Still, these narrow paths mattered. They show that medieval women were not all trapped in one identical life. Some moved through loss into authority. Some entered religion and found learning. Some used widowhood to protect children, property, and memory. Some refused remarriage. Some became patrons, healers, managers, teachers, and spiritual figures. Their freedom was not wide, but it was not nothing. Picture a widow at a table late at night. A candle burns low beside a small pile of coins, a key, a folded cloth, perhaps a document she cannot read, but knows is important. The house still carries her husband's absence like a cold place near the fire. Tomorrow she must speak to a man who thinks he can frighten her into surrendering what is owed. She is afraid, but she has counted the coins twice. She knows the debt, she knows the witness. She knows at last that when she speaks in court, it may be her own name the clerk writes down. That does not make the world kind, but it changes the sound of her voice. Not every act of resistance looked like rebellion. Most medieval women could not afford open defiance. A loud refusal might bring punishment. Leaving a husband might bring hunger. Speaking too freely could become evidence of disorder. Challenging a father, lord, priest, or master required more than courage. It required protection, witnesses, money, kin, or luck. So many women resisted in smaller ways. They delayed. They hid. They remembered. They chose the safer listener. They used the law when the law could serve them, and avoided it when it would only expose them. A woman might keep a coin tucked into the seam of a garment, not because she was greedy, but because she understood how quickly a household could turn desperate. A sick child, a lost hen, a husband drunk too long at the alehouse, a bad harvest, a debt called in at the wrong time. Any of these could make a hidden coin feel like breath. She might pretend not to hear an insult in the market, then later warn every woman she trusted not to sell to that man on credit. She might obey her husband in front of neighbors and argue with him beside the dying fire, where no clerk could turn her voice into record. She might teach her daughter obedience with her mouth and caution with her eyes. These were not romantic victories. They did not overturn the world, but they kept women alive inside it. Some defiance lived in knowledge. Women knew things because they had to. They knew birth dates, debts, promises, bloodlines, recipes, illnesses, affairs, tempers, hiding places, and the true history of households that men described more simply in public. A woman who knew when a child was conceived, who had visited during a fever, who had lent linen for a burial, who had overheard a promise at a doorway she carried evidence no parchment held. Memory could become power. It could also become danger. A woman had to know when to speak what she knew. Too early, and she might be dismissed. Too late, and the chance was gone. To the wrong person, and the knowledge could turn against her. Much of women's survival depended on timing, that quiet art rarely celebrated in chronicles. Other defiance moved through networks. A wife alone might be weak, but a wife with sisters, neighbors, cousins, midwives, servants, and market women around her had more room to move. Women borrowed from one another, covered for one another, warned one another, sat with one another in childbirth, repeated rumors when useful, and buried them when mercy required it. A village could watch women. Women also watched the village. They knew which man paid late, which priest was fair, which household beat servants, which widow had grain to spare, which road was unsafe after dusk. Their information traveled through wells, kitchens, wash places, churchyards, and stalls. Not in official language, not sealed, not signed, but alive. This quiet exchange could soften the law's harshness. A woman facing an accusation might need someone to say she had been elsewhere. A young servant might need an older woman to believe her. A widow might need neighbors to confirm a debt. A pregnant, unmarried girl might need someone brave enough to hide her, help her, or speak for her when shame closed in. When women helped each other, they were not always being sentimental. They were building shelter out of human attention. There were also sharper forms of resistance. Some women went to court. They sued for slander, wages, inheritance, separation, broken marriage promises, or unpaid debts. They complained about violence. They defended their rights as widows. They named men who had wronged them, even when doing so meant placing private pain in public hands. This was risky, but it mattered. To stand before authority and insist on a claim was a kind of courage the law did not expect from every woman. The court might still doubt her. The outcome might still disappoint her. But the act itself left a trace. A clerk wrote her name. A complaint entered the record. For a moment, her grievance became harder to erase. Some women resisted by refusing the roles offered to them neatly. A widow did not remarry. A daughter chose a convent over a husband. A wife became too valuable in trade to ignore. A healer kept practicing after whispers began. A poor woman answered back because silence had brought her nothing. Every refusal carried risk. Yet life is full of moments when obedience becomes impossible, not because a person is fearless, but because they are tired of being reduced. Still, the most common defiance was probably the least visible, the preservation of an inner life. A woman could be judged by her veil, her work, her marriage, her fertility, her silence, her obedience, and still keep thoughts no one owned. She could kneel in church and pray words shaped by doctrine, while privately asking for something no priest had named. She could share a bed with a husband and remember a different tenderness. She could listen to men decide and quietly know they were wrong. That hidden self matters. Power often wants not only action, but agreement. It wants the controlled person to believe the story told about them. Medieval law, custom, and religion often told women they were weaker, more dangerous, more dependent, less trustworthy. Some may have believed it. Many must have half believed it, fought it, accepted parts of it, rejected parts of it, and carried on. But somewhere, in ordinary rooms, women kept evidence against the story. They knew who rose first. They knew who made the bread. They knew who remembered the debts. They knew who sat with the dying. They knew whose hands washed blood from linen after childbirth. They knew whose labor held the day together. A world can deny a woman's authority and still depend on it so completely that the denial begins to look almost frightened. Imagine near midnight, a woman sitting alone after the household has gone quiet. The fire is low. Her hands smell faintly of onions, wool, and smoke. On the table is a small repair she has not finished. In the next room, someone breathes unevenly in sleep. No one would call this moment political, but perhaps it is. She takes the hidden coin from its place and moves it somewhere safer. She thinks of what must be bought tomorrow. She thinks of the words she will not say, and the one sentence she may finally speak. She thinks of her daughter, asleep under a thin cover, and of the rules waiting for that child like winter beyond the door. Then she returns the coin to darkness, not free, not defeated, still thinking, still choosing, still there. By the end of a medieval woman's life, the law may have touched almost everything around her. Her father's authority, her marriage, her property, her wages, her body, her children, her reputation, her right to speak, inherit, leave, remain, accuse, defend, and be believed. It may have followed her from cradle to church porch, from marriage bed to market stall, from birthing room to courtroom, from widow's table to the quiet place where old women sat near the fire and remembered more than anyone asked them to tell. But law is not the same as life. It can shape a life. It can narrow it. It can punish, record, shame, command, and define. But it cannot fully own what happens inside a person. That is where we should end tonight, not with the rules alone, but with the space they failed to reach completely. A woman might be called dependent and still hold a household together with a steadiness no document measured. She might be told to obey and still know exactly when obedience had become performance. She might be judged by chastity, silence, fertility, modesty, and usefulness, yet carry a private self larger than any category made for her. The medieval world tried to name women carefully: maiden, wife, widow, nun, servant, mother, whore, saint, scold, witch. Each word opened or closed a door. Each word told others how to see her, but no word could contain the whole person. A wife was not only a wife. A widow was not only loss. A servant was not only labor. A mother was not only sacrifice. Even a woman shamed in public did not become only the shame placed upon her. She remained someone with memory, and memory is stubborn. She remembered the first house she left, the sound of her mother's voice, the day she understood she would be married, the smell of wet wool in winter, the first child who lived, the child who did not, the neighbor who helped, the man who frightened her, the priest who listened, the debt repaid after years, the insult she swallowed, the answer she kept ready but never spoke. History often preserves women only when they entered trouble, property, marriage, religion, or court. It catches them when something had to be written down: a dispute, a payment, a vow, a punishment, a death, a donation, a rumor serious enough to become record. But most of their lives happened between records, in mornings, in kitchens, in fields, in tired hands washing linen, in the low voice used beside a sickbed, in the pause before answering a husband, in the small pride of a well-brewed ale, in the warmth of a sleeping child against the body, in the ordinary endurance that rarely looked dramatic enough for chronicles. To ask how harsh life was for women under medieval law is to admit that it was often deeply harsh, not always in the same way. Not every woman suffered equally. Class, region, age, wealth, family, widowhood, religion, and luck all mattered. Some women had power, some used the law. Some commanded estates, managed shops, led convents, defended rights, and left marks strong enough to survive centuries. But the basic pressure remained. A woman's life was frequently treated as something to be managed by others. Her virtue watched, her speech weighed, her labor assumed, her sexuality guarded, her dependence praised as order, her resistance named disorder. That is harshness, even when no one raises a hand. It is harsh to be necessary and distrusted. It is harsh to work without full authority over the fruits of that work. It is harsh to have your body made into a matter of family honor, public concern, and legal consequence. It is harsh to know that reputation may protect you, but only if others agree to protect it too. It is harsh to live in a world where safety often requires being smaller than you are. And yet, if we leave them only as victims, we make another kind of mistake. Women were not merely crushed beneath medieval law. They moved through it, sometimes carefully, sometimes boldly, sometimes with fear, sometimes with skill. They made choices where choices existed, and meanings where choices did not. They loved, calculated, worked, prayed, lied, saved, taught, remembered, bargained, endured, and occasionally refused. Their humanity did not wait for permission. Imagine the woman from the first evening one last time. Years have passed. Or perhaps she is not the same woman at all, but many women gathered into one figure. Daughter, wife, worker, mother, widow, neighbor, witness. She sits near the door as daylight thins. Her hands are older now. The lines in them hold soap, flour, soil, smoke, and time. Outside, the town continues as it always has. A cart passes, a bell rings, someone calls for a child. Somewhere, men discuss land, taxes, trade, law, inheritance, God. Inside, she knows what they do not. She knows how much of life has depended on work that was barely named. She knows how many rules were survived rather than accepted. She knows the difference between silence and surrender. She knows the places in a household where money can be hidden, where grief can be held, where truth can wait. Perhaps no one will write that down. Perhaps the record will remember her only by relation to a man, or not at all. But the absence of a full record is not the absence of a life. The law may have claimed her obedience. The household may have claimed her labor. The church may have claimed her virtue. The market may have claimed her voice. The family may have claimed her body, her marriage, her children, her name. But somewhere beneath all those claims, something remained difficult to take. A private thought, a remembered kindness, a refusal hidden deep enough to survive, a love that did not belong to the law, a self. And as the room grows quiet, as the fire settles into red ash, as the medieval town disappears into night, we can leave her there not rescued from her world, not made falsely free, but seen more clearly. A woman under law, a woman inside history, a woman who lived.